Tonight's lineup, tonight at the Active Travel Cafe, we will start as usual with our crowdsourced news update. So if you have anything to share from wherever you are, or if you have something that you'd like to share that's happening nationally or even internationally, please put your hand up in a moment. And then I am really delighted to say that we have Tom Cohen and Ersilia Verlinghieri, hope I think I've got that right, Ersilia, who are going to update us on the work that they have done for the All Party Parliamentary Group for Cycling and Walking's inquiry on active travel and social justice. And Tom was reminding me that report was published earlier in the year in the spring, and so it's really great that we have them on to sort of hear a little bit more about it and what's come out of that. But before we move on to our speakers, does anyone have anything that they would like to share with the group? Tell me nobody has any news. Oh, Matthew.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sally. So I'm a councillor in Darlington and I sit on the Communities and Local Services Scrutiny Panel, which has highways in there. Part of our key performance indicators are road death and slight and serious injuries. They're very often presented as, well, we're better than so-and-so, or we're only slightly up on last year, but, you know, small numbers, big swings. I've managed to get working with colleagues from other parties. I'm a Green Party, but I was working with Conservative councillors to get an item on the work programme to view road injury, road danger as a sort of a public health viewpoint rather than a data gathering from highways, and using the lens of harm reduction, which people may be familiar with. Substance use is often viewed through two lenses, one of crime prevention, the other one of harm reduction. So I'm putting together a sort of a quad of aims to look at how we as an authority can adopt a new way of working. We've identified three themes. One is communications, and I'm really indebted to, I think, road collision reporting guidelines, which have been passed by the Royal College of the Journalists Union, as to how road injury and road risk should be reported. So we're not anonymising drivers. We're talking about a driver. We're talking about being hit with a car rather than a car losing control, for instance. So I'm quite happy that that work stream works well. The other one is data collection, and we're looking at it through an industry perspective, where in industry you log near misses. You try and avoid the injury by seeking to identify where the risk is prior to injury. I'm aware that, for example, in the West Midlands, they were using LiDAR on council vehicles to try and judge near misses. But I was really interested if there was anyone here who could send me information on, public citizen science or citizen reporting that was fairly low cost, fairly simple, easy to use, so that we could start collecting near miss data from the public, and a way of maybe adding that to our standard reporting, so you can report a pothole or a street light that's out or a bin that's overflowing. And if anyone had any experience of that working well, or who I should be speaking to get that. And the third work stream is, once we've got the reporting correct and we've got the data, is looking through a Vision Zero approach to acknowledge that people are fallible, and we should be designing systems that fail safe rather than fail dangerously. And that third work stream, I'm less worried about having good evidence of how we do that from coming to Active Travel Cafe and learning from people here. So yeah, that was probably spoken too long, but if anyone has any idea on how we can start collecting data of near miss collisions so we can act before someone is injured or killed, I'd be very happy to get that. I can put my email in the comments.
Thank you, Matthew. And hopefully some people do have ideas. Please email Matthew or contribute to the chat. Roger.
Hi, thanks. So yeah, Roger from Low Traffic Future. Just to say, we've been having a bit of a review of what our priorities are as Low Traffic Future. We've been going for kind of about 3 years. We set out rather ambitiously to try and promote less car dependence locally and nationally. To some extent, we were over optimistic about the extent to which the wider network of environmental and health and safety and all sorts of groups would be able to come together around transport under a new government that we thought had got the message on other aspects of net zero, even if not on transport and on air quality and all sorts of things. And there's an awful lot of rowing backwards going on that mean that some of the wider environmental groups and air quality and health groups are still having to fight battles on things like, does the British public actually want clean air and net zero? And of course, they're worried about Reform UK. So the idea that we'd have an alliance that would really kind of get us back to where we were in the 90s, where everybody in the environment movement was doing transport, hasn't really happened. So we thought, okay, this is harder work than we thought. Do we do national? Do we do local? We've decided we're going to go local. We've decided local politicians are more responsive to transport. Local campaign groups have fewer of the constraints that national campaign groups have about worrying about biting the national government hand that feeds some of them. So we're planning a first meeting to bring together local groups, whether your interests are active travel or clean air or road safety or saving local parks or whatever, to create a wider network of allies at the local level in similar ways to what we've done at the national level, similar kind of broaden the range of allies of people pushing for less traffic at the local level to share experience, share knowledge. And we're having a first meeting. I'll ping a link in the chat in a sec on Thursday week, 10th of July, kind of see what we can do by way of helping networks to form, to learn from one another. It's in some ways very similar to what Rod King did with 20s Plenty for Us, for those of you who know about that. It's a very similar model of build it up from the local level until we've got enough local strength to be able to really go national again. So hopefully see some of you on the 10th of July, and I'll ping a link in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you, Roger. I mean, you might also, I don't know whether you're kind of already engaged in this, but I think next week we've got Harry Gray from Manchester who's going to come and talk about kind of trying to bring together a sort of bigger network of active travel campaigners. So if you're not, then that might be something to come along and find out about.
I definitely want to have a conversation with Harry, because I mean, Harry's very obviously clearly wanting to do something specifically around active travel. There are clear overlaps between what he wants to do, what we want to do. We want to make sure that we do things that are complementary, not treading on each other's toes. But I haven't had that conversation with Harry yet. But there is clearly there's somebody else as well, an American guy who's also sort of like, can we get together a wider network of people to reduce car dependence or promote active travel? There is a zeitgeist going on where several people are thinking, what can we do? And we clearly need to have a few conversations to make sure it all joins up.
Great.
Harry's definitely a conversation I want to have to make sure, because we're trying to do the same thing, but ours, as I say, is not limited to active travel, but it is part of it.
Great. Thanks, Roger. Will.
Hello there. Here in Colchester, we're about to have the Northern Approach Road cycleway open, which is adjacent to a busway. It's 1.2 kilometres long, and it is really, really high quality. We're ever so pleased with it. The only problem at the moment is it doesn't connect into the cycleway into town by about 200 metres, and that's it. But we're hoping for that in the future. The other point I'd like to raise is I comment in detail on all the planning applications that come through. And one thing we're getting at the moment is the LTN 120 and things like that are all based towards destination cycle parking rather than cycle parking at home. And some of the rubbish we're getting still for cycle parking at home is terrible. Kind of they're looking online, they're getting terrible racks, they're getting wheel benders, and we've got to really keep our eye on the ball to get these through. One today that I was dealing with was simply a garden shed with a very narrow door, and I'm just wondering whether the people who are writing them, if they're on the call, writing this sort of guidance, could bear in mind what needs to be done for storing bikes at home. I'm helped with the Essex parking guide. In fact, it's very a very bleak the Essex parking guide, but it does have one thing in that cycling should be more convenient than the car parking. So I'm making the most of that. But if anyone on here is involved in writing guidance or anything like that, can we please have a look at cycle parking at home? Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Will. Any ideas about cycle parking, please put them in the chat. H.
Yeah, got it. Sorry, three things come now. There's cycle parking at home. I was going to comment on a bike box, a buried cycle box, which somebody is developing based on continental practice. And coming back to Will, in 2003, I did work with Hackney cyclists, and we produced a report called Home Bike Park Hackney, using that as a branding. And we looked at about 8 different ways of making cycle storage in residential flats. I started on this with my 1997 report for DETR and highlighted residential parking being a key thing to reduce the inertia and the seamlessness of being able to pick a bike up. Because in 1998, one of the people I looked at with a study on residential parking in Edinburgh, when she wanted to go out on her bike, she had to go 200 meters up the street to get her bike out of her parents' house in order to come back and pick up her child and shopping to go out on the bike. It's not as convenient as picking the car keys up. But to come back further on reporting, which was, I think Matthew was saying, my neighbour's a pilot. They have chirps. Pilots self-report. And I suggest that people might want to read Black Box Thinking by Matthew Syed, being able to report the mistakes you make and self-report with no fear of being penalised for it. In other words, when you self-report, you say, I made a mistake. It was lucky this time. Nobody got hurt, but we can learn a lesson from this. There's a corresponding thing for the rail industry called CIRUS, which applies to railways and trams. And we've been trying to get it going in the bus industry, where if something goes wrong, people can anonymously report it. It gets investigated and reported back to by the employer. And we've had this in Glasgow. Glasgow got fined £20,000 for killing a pedestrian in 2014 because they were reversing a refuse truck without an attendant on foot, managing all the traffic in the surrounding. And as such, all Glasgow refuse trucks have a crew, and the crew member gets out and instructs the driver and surrounding traffic when the truck has to make a maneuver in a tight space like reversing. And this is the sort of thing that has to be written into the protocols and is a requirement for the Health and Safety at Work Act. Thank you.
Thanks, thank you. That's great. We have to move on because we've got to get on to our speakers and we've got 2 more hands up. Patrick. Oh, you're on mute. Still on mute? Patrick, can you hear? No. Andy, should we go to you?
Hello. Yeah, while Patrick's there working out his mute. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about everyone's favourite topic of potholes. Here in Wiltshire, I've been having huge issues over the last couple of years just trying to get the council to even repair potholes. Apparently we've got a nationwide leading app called My Wilts that allows us to report things like potholes. My experience is that every time I report a pothole, it's almost closed down immediately, saying it doesn't meet the criteria for potholes to be repaired, which is all driven by cars. So if it affects a cyclist or a pedestrian, it generally doesn't get repaired. Some of them are getting so big that they are repairing them, but that literally involves basically chucking a load of tarmac into the pothole, which normally results in that tarmac coming out in a few months, and the pothole's even bigger. I have been trying to find out what the criteria is for actually resurfacing a road or a cycle path or a pavement versus just chucking a load of tarmac in. And so I've got a couple of FOIs in on that one. I haven't been able to get any information yet, but I did come across a Freedom of Information request in Wiltshire a couple of months ago by a guy called Steve Thomas, who was asking similar questions. And one of the probably most alarming elements, but probably not surprising, is that Wiltshire Council don't know how much it costs to repair a pothole, which is probably very concerning. But in the spirit of austerity and cost savings that still seems to be with us, I think that that's something that potentially we need to get some information on. If anyone's got any thoughts on that, I'd be willing to hear them. And I'll report back once I know what the criteria is around resurfacing versus repairing. I think you're on mute, Sally.
Oh, now I'm doing it. Have we got you there? Thank you, Andy. If anybody's got any idea about potholes, please put them in the chat. Patrick, have we got you there?
Am I back or not? Can you hear me? So it's my
Yeah.
laptop's playing up for some reason. Well, just two brief things. First of all, next week on Wednesday and Thursday, I think there's the transport practitioners meet, at which I'm speaking about, are we doing the right thing, with the implication that we're not doing the right thing. So if anybody's interested in reading or either going to the conference or reading my paper, I'm happy to share it. And the other thing is, I don't know, I say it's the first time I've been in, so I'm not sure what you're doing, but I mean, in Oxfordshire, we are, the Oxfordshire County Council, which I was worked for up until 6 months ago, is consulting on introducing congestion charge in the city centre. It's the 6 weeks consultation is going on. And I dare say it's going to be a very, very hectic time to have, but their proposal is that they'll make a decision in September. So just for your information, so if you go on the Oxfordshire Let's Talk consultation, what they're about to do.
Thank you, Patrick. Your sound's breaking up a bit, so if you want to re-add that to the chat, summary of what you said, that would be great.
All right. For some reason, my laptop's playing up quite a moment. I don't know why. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you. And then I have a kind of final bit of news, and I'll put that in the chat, but I'm organising an event, collaboration with the social change organisation Playing Out, that will be held in Newcastle in September, and that's looking at how we might look at bringing look at active travel and play and children's needs, but sort of bringing active travel and play together rather than sort of artificially separating them as we normally do. And that's called Making Streets Safe for Children, and I'll put a link in the chat. And it would be great to share that far and wide. It's aimed at really kind of anybody who, again, is engaged in active travel, whether it's local authorities, practitioners, advocates, whoever, all welcome. And we will now move on to our speaker section for the evening. And I'm really, really pleased tonight to have Tom Cohen and Ersilia Verlinghieri, who are going to talk about the All Party Parliamentary Group for Cycling and Walking's inquiry on active travel and social justice. Very, very important topic. So I shall hand over to you, Tom and Ersilia, if you want to share your slides.
Sure, thank you. So I must start with the obligatory, can you hear me?
Yep, and see.
And can you see the slides?
Yeah, all great.
We're well away. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Fellow Active Travel Cafe. It's my first time. Forgive me if I'm a little nervous. My colleague Ersilia has done this before, so she'll be very steady, I'm sure. I should say that in addition to us, we also have a strategic guest star in the form of Adam Kaufman, whom many of you will know as the Secretariat for the APPG. This for the practical reason that we can tell you what we did and what we recommended. Adam, I think, can provide very useful context as to where this piece of work came from and where it might lead. So I'm glad he's here, and I've no doubt that some of your questions, maybe most of them, are going to be better answered by him. But I'll get us started. Well, certainly I'll attempt to. So there are three players in this game. There's the All Party Parliamentary Group for Cycling and Walking itself. We, Ersilia and I, are based at the University of Westminster, but perhaps you might know us more as members of the Active Travel Academy. I sincerely hope that you're all familiar with us, and there is no brand clash. The world can accommodate a cafe and academy, I think. You will know Rachel Aldred, who is our director, And it was great to hear mention of various things already during the call which have our name on them. So the road collision reporting guidelines were drafted by Laura when she was doing a fellowship with us. And questions about near misses. I think there's already been a reference to work done by Rachel in the past. So her near miss project was a prize winner. And I imagine that would be of some use methodologically. But so we worked together. Ersilia and I were appointed by the All Party Parliamentary Group to do this piece of work on active travel and social justice. In terms of what we did, well, some of this was standard issue for how the APPG does its inquiries. It commonly has a hearing or more than one hearing. And on this occasion, we had one. It was in December of last year. We had 9 witnesses representing quite a nice range of different protected characteristics and interests in the issue of social justice where active travel is concerned. That was a very lively session, and the parliamentarians, I think, got a great deal out of it in terms of the richness of what was said, the variety of what was put forward. We then launched an appeal for written submissions, and this broke the APPG's record with more than 90 being received, a very wide range of great stuff, useful information, some cracking ideas, which you won't be surprised to know we borrowed from heavily when we were doing the drafting itself. But I suppose just the number of submissions tells you how important this topic feels to people. It really does resonate for folk from all sides, I think. Another thing which we did, and I credit Ersilia for this idea, was that we convened an advisory board so that it wasn't just she and I coming up with these ideas, but we were bouncing ideas off 6 experts from the sector who were seeing drafts of our materials and commenting and making their own suggestions. And I think that greatly improved the quality of the final result. And then the final bit was that we're academics, so we were naturally referring to our own knowledge of the literature as we went about the work. So those were the bits. I will shortly hand over to Ersilia, who'll take you through the main body of the report, but this is how the report looks, and it's available online, so you can have your own copy as a PDF. And there are even physical copies, but they're like hen's teeth, so you have to know who to know. But the structure is, as you might expect, we try to introduce the topic before getting into the whys and wherefores. What are the problems? Why is social justice proving difficult to achieve within active travel? And then the solutions, because it's really important in work of this sort to recognize that there's fantastic work already being done. And so a large part of our recommendations is based on, well, making the best use of what's already being done rather than simply going back to first principles. And then I'll come back after Ersilia has spoken to tell you about the recommendations, of which there are 9. So at this point, I will pass over to Ersilia to take us forward.
Thank you, Tom. So yes, as Tom said, I'll take you through the main sections of the report. It's important to reiterate, as Tommy mentioned before, that we're looking at social injustice within active travel. So we try to describe this as particularly a low representation of certain groups, minoritized groups within those that walk, will, and cycle, under the different axes of discrimination in terms of gender, ethnicity, sexuality, age, disability, and socioeconomic status. We also acknowledge that these people that belong to these groups and the intersection of these groups are affected by, in different ways, by these injustices. So we really need to think about interventions which target them in appropriate ways. But we also acknowledge that improving active travel overall will benefit everyone, and in some cases, particularly those groups. So we need to think about social justice in active travel at the same time as thinking about more broadly social justice in transport. And as we see in this next slide, we also set some fundamental principles at the basis of our report. Tom, can you send me next slide? So we set some, like a scene which we say, yes, there are recommendations that we want to highlight. There are important barriers and facilitators to achieving social justice in active travel, but there are some fundamental things we know from previous research, from years of conversations and debates, which is that it is fundamental to reduce road danger. It is important to have sustained and predictable funding for active travel, which allow local authorities and whoever is taking decisions to achieve the existing targets which have been set for numbers of people walking, wheeling, and cycling. We also need to have good, high-quality infrastructure which are truly accessible. that need to meet the needs of all of those that have protected characteristics. It means not just being accessible on paper, actually being welcoming to all. And in the next slide, if you can go there, Tom, you through the beginning of the report. So as we said, we started to identify the barriers to achieving social justice in active travel. They take different forms. One key one is the evident uneven provision of appropriate environments for walking, wheeling, and cycling. There's been a few examples, just as we were discussing in the introduction, in terms of like either not well set up or even non-existing infrastructure, which when they're combined with speed, with aggressive behavior, driving behavior, and limited enforcement, make active travel unsafe for a lot of people. And we know that this is a major deterrent to uptake. And we also know that these conditions affect disproportionately people from minoritized groups in terms of income, gender, age, disability, and so on. One example is the one you can see in the green box. For each barrier, I picked one of the many examples we collected through the submissions and through the review of the literature. For example, we had some submissions that were mentioning how the lack of adequate infrastructure is a main barrier for children and young people to be able to walk, wheel, and cycle safely. Parents are very aware of this and are highlighting how the importance of like providing those conditions. There's been an interesting suggestion of really thinking about embedding a child lens in local and national transport to make sure that these improvements are made. And there are lots of other examples of how like bad quality infrastructure is really making active travel unjust for lots of groups. In the next slides, we go to the second barrier we identified, which is the uneven distribution access to cycles and mobility aids. There is a high cost associated with being able to acquiring, but also renting or even storing a cycle or a mobility aid, which means with a lot of people that are maybe willing to walk, wheel, and cycle aren't currently doing so. And this, as we expect, affects particularly those on low incomes, particularly affects disabled people. And it's a key thing that needs to be addressed. In the slide, again, one of the examples, which was about the high cost for disabled people to acquire mobility aids or cycles, especially when they're adapted cycles, with 16% of disabled people reporting they cannot access mobility aids, even if they will need them to get around. Next slide is the final kind of family of barriers we identified, which is also a more kind of cultural environmental barrier we identified in terms of how we talk and how we speak about active travel, but also in terms of often like aggressive environment or like lack of perception of danger, perception of road dangers, but also experience of harassment when walking, wheeling, and cycling, aggression that people face on roads. This means also there are also certain norms and expectations around how one is supposed to travel, and which means that certain choices are not seen as appropriate and people don't take them. One example in the slide is again about the way fear of aggression becomes a main barrier for women and girls to travel around, to walk and cycle and wheel around, especially when it's dark. And it's just one example of the many, as I say, many barriers have been discussing and they've been reported by the different submissions to the inquiry. So having identified this kind of different barriers, we looked at which ways policy can act. One key way in response of the fact that like the walking, wheeling, and cycling environments need improvements is to improve those, of course. So thinking about the ways this can be done. And again, I need to reiterate, we acknowledge that funding, it is fundamental. It is fundamental that those improvements are made so that all the new infrastructure are fully accessible. We collected some examples you can see in the slides in terms of, like, for example, London's progress in delivering high quality cycling infrastructure has been to an extent important in the way like new cycleway quality criteria have been followed, but also in the way the analysis of where cycling infrastructure are implemented and who is going to use them is perhaps like helping directing investments in the areas and for those communities that need them more. Another example of important ways to achieving social justice, and this is the next slide, Tom, which is thinking about providing frameworks for affordable and accessible mobility aids and cycles to be provided. So one example that was highlighted in the submission was the National Free Bikers Network, which allows people to access free bikes across the UK. It was one of the many examples on how like incentives, but also like actions from certain groups allow people to overcome barriers in terms of like accessing cycles, but also there's a big conversation also on storage, as we saw before, and maintaining and repairing those cycles and those mobility aids. And the final facilitators we identify is the role of community interventions, which are key in really making sure that all those actions are taking place. I think it's been really clear in the way, in the submissions, but also in the conversation we had when putting together the report, that a lot of grassroots organizations are doing most of the work and doing very, very important work in terms of setting up training sessions, in setting up cycle groups, in setting up support networks for those that want to wheel, walk, and cycle and currently cannot, or they're doing in the best conditions. So we acknowledge their role and we acknowledge the importance of supporting them in all the work they're doing and making sure that they can do work in the future as well. And back to Tom for the recommendations.
Thanks, Ersilia. It's unfortunate. I just wanted to reiterate something before getting into the recommendations themselves. And Ersilia's made this point very effectively, and I just think it's worth reinforcing. The recommendations we make relate to social justice within active travel, but there's no point in doing the sorts of things that we recommend here for as long as the fundamentals remain inadequate. So no, it's not that there's no point, but it's just that these things that we recommend here are going to have much less effect, will do an awful lot less for social justice if the fundamentals aren't in place. So that's something which is probably worth saying again. The other thing to say about the recommendations is that they're not in a particular order. And I'll admit that I feel just slightly squeamish that the first one relates to cycling, because I tend to feel as if cycling gets, understandably maybe, a great deal of the limelight where active travel is concerned. But what we discovered, no real surprise, is that walking is in a great extent a distressed purchase, and cycling is something from which a lot of people are excluded. An awful lot of people are enduring unacceptable walking conditions, walking and wheeling conditions for that matter. But anyway, be that as it may, we did talk a little bit about intersectionality, and the thing which recurs again and again is income. Someone might be disabled, the chances are they will also be on a low income. Someone might be from a minoritized ethnic community, they might well be on a low income at the same time. So reducing the financial barriers to cycling does make sense as the first recommendation from that perspective. The various bits, I won't go into them at great length, but cycle to work being changed so that it's no longer something enjoyed only by people on a certain income, but is much more widely available, including people on low incomes and pensioners. A particular point about e-cycle subsidy, because e-cycles have such potential to revolutionize travel for people, particularly in areas of sparse development, but we know that e-cycles are expensive. The one about VAT on adapted cycles is familiar. It's come up in previous APPG reports, but it needs to be restated because it continues to be a serious problem. Adapted cycles also need to be included in the Motability scheme. And then the point on hangar spaces might seem a bit niche, but some of you will be living in areas where it costs more to rent a space within a hangar than it does to get a parking permit for your car. That's so evidently wrong, and it ought to change. Another one which is familiar is pavement parking. Everyone on this call, I imagine, will be familiar with the consultation which has been hanging around since 2020. We just added our voice to the call for action. And more specifically, we said of the options presented in the consultation, the decriminalisation one probably offers the best path, the best balance between the ways in which you can do it. Of course, I don't need also to tell you that Scotland is leading the way on pavement parking, so we could all just copy them. This is a more general point, and it doesn't relate entirely to active travel, but it's certainly more pronounced in active travel, and that is that we don't really have very good data. If we want to know what's going on in the world of active travel, and in particular social justice or lack of it in active travel, we need better data on who's traveling, who's obstructed from traveling and why. And we also need to know when we do something, build something or introduce some kind of intervention, whether it's actually had the desired effect. Data are central to that. There is a general feeling that we could do better on cycle training. It's widely available, but it's not universally available. And in particular, it's being enjoyed by certain groups more than others. School children on the whole tend to get cycle training for free, adults less so. And the provision of cycle training doesn't represent the full diversity of the population that might travel by that means. So efforts on top of what's already being done, some community organisations are leading the way. So this is just a recommendation to embrace that and build on it. There is quite a lot of bad infrastructure out there, I don't need to tell you, and much of it presents a real obstacle to wheelchair users and others with mobility impairments. And whilst inclusive mobility isn't by any means perfect, it's pretty good. And if it were made more than simply advisory and became a design standard, then we might see a general uplift in the quality of infrastructure. We know that LTN 120 is doing good work for making cycle infrastructure better, but we are still waiting for the revised manual for streets. And in the meantime, a lot of pretty mediocre stuff is being laid down. Making inclusive mobility a design standard would be one step in the right direction. Again, this is perhaps one of the more process-based issues, but it is critical. Some highways authorities and planning organisations do a really good job of bringing diverse voices into the planning process. And they're not doing it as a form of lip service. They're actually making that involvement meaningful. And they're committing to taking account of what they're told and explaining why they do or do not do what has been recommended. We're simply saying that should be standard. It should be countrywide. It shouldn't just be something which is done by the enlightened few. And this is something which Ersilia touched on. A lot of the really excellent work is being done by community-based organisations. What they told us, though, is that they're generally in a fairly parlous financial situation. They struggle to make ends meet, and they never know what's going to be happening next year. They're providing a service, and local authorities need to provide them with the kind of financial footing which enables them to plan and to have some confidence so that they can continue to do their work and expand upon it. So it's just about systematising the delivery of work by community-based organisations. But I should pause again and say, this is the kind of recommendation which feels pretty empty if the fundamentals aren't in place, if there isn't substantial and adequate funding to support active travel, full stop. So if I haven't said it enough, I might say it again before we finish. This is another system-wide suggestion, and it doesn't relate only to active travel. Social justice is something which certain planning and transport authorities, highway authorities have embraced, but not very many. And in fact, we would suggest that the term social justice isn't particularly widely understood. What about if transport authorities and highway authorities were required to build social justice into their activities? What if they had to report on how they were doing? What if they had to say how their interventions had performed in terms of addressing social injustice? What if they had a named officer whose duty it was to deal with issues of social justice in transport planning? It would be great to see that across transport. It would be even better to see it in just active travel, or active travel in particular. The final one is quite specific, but it's very much merited. Some of you will be familiar with work being done on access control barriers by our colleague, Harry Langton Spencer, and her colleagues within the Active Travel Academy. So these things, which are generally introduced with good intentions to discourage antisocial use of motorcycles, don't generally succeed in that regard, but in the process tend to make facilities inaccessible for people using adapted cycles of all sorts. So access control barriers are a problem and they need to come out, particularly because they're frequently in the sorts of amenities that are most enjoyed by people who aren't necessarily the most confident cyclists. So associated with that is the idea that we would also strengthen action against antisocial use of motorcycles. So if the access control barriers aren't doing the trick, then we need to use more police powers in order to discourage that negative behaviour at the same time as enabling the behaviour which currently those barriers are precluding. So those are the recommendations. There's 9 of them. Just so as you know, there it is on the internet, and someone far-sighted will possibly drop a link into the chat, but hold on everybody, there's a QR code coming. So get your cameras ready. And just for information and maybe interest, the report got quite a lot of attention in the media, and that's in large part thanks to the excellent work of Fusion Media, who are very good at promoting this kind of thing. This particular page from the Telegraph I find entertaining because no doubt Joe Wright struggled in trying to find out how to couch this story. Taxpayers must fund bikes for refugees, boo, and pensioners, yay, MPs tell Labour. So I suspect that he struggled to work out how to present that particular piece in terms of balance. It is in the text mentioned as a bizarre campaign, so I get the feeling that the Telegraph's standard line is being pursued. And there's elsewhere on the page, not that particular article, but there was a link to something about lycra-clad Britons earning 6-digit salaries benefiting from this scheme. So yeah, I think normal service will be resumed in the Telegraph, if not immediately, then probably the following day. Nevertheless, it's gratifying that work of this sort was picked up by mainstream media, because something on active travel and social justice could be seen as ridiculously niche and get ignored. But because Fusion Media were able to pick out the elements of the story that would really resonate with people, it did get quite a lot of coverage. I threatened a QR code. I'm as good as my word. So there it is. I will, I think, leave it on the screen for a matter of seconds, and then I shall stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Tom and Ersilia. That was just a really great summary and really great piece of work. And I'm sure we have lots and lots of questions. Before we go on to the questions, Adam, are you with us? Adam Coffey.
Hi, how you doing?
Oh, there he is. Hello, thank you for joining us. I don't know if you want to say a little bit about kind of how this came about, this inquiry, and
I can, yeah, sure.
That would be really great.
I can. We're very grateful to be working with Lee Day, the solicitors, and British Cycling. So they supported this inquiry. We worked with them previously on the relook at the road justice inquiry or road justice recommendations, and we worked with Tom on that. That was, remind me, Tom, 2023, I think it was.
It was.
And that was a really successful in terms of, we felt that we really got a very strong list of recommendations. And we are still, in terms of the road justice recommendations, we are still sort of lobbying on that, and we're still campaigning on that. We were hoping for slightly more leverage post 4th of July 2024 than has actually happened, but we are promised that things might move in the next 6 months on road safety and road justice. So we definitely are keeping going on that. In terms of this inquiry, Lee Day and British Cycling were really keen to work with us again, and we thought that with a new government in place, we thought it'd be really pertinent to look at aspects of active travel and social justice, as we thought the door would be not necessarily wide open, but ajar on these issues. I think it's fair to say that perhaps not everything that we'd hoped of has happened in the last 12 months around active travel, including some of the really big hitting stuff like pavement parking. And we really genuinely thought that when we were hatching ideas for this inquiry, and we didn't have any preconceived ideas as to what the recommendations would be. And I think Tom and Ersilia have explained that very clearly, that they came from pretty wide coalition of people, but particularly the advisory group. So we didn't know exactly what was going to be coming out of the recommendations, but it wasn't a surprise to us that pavement parking was one of those. And we just thought around this time last year when we started planning this inquiry that we would be having a fairly friendly open door to these kind of policies at DFT. Subsequently, things have been slightly disappointing. But at the same time, we do have some ministers that at least are saying the right things on this stuff, even though the policies haven't necessarily been enacted. So yeah, that's sort of really how it came about. We thought it was going to be an opportunity to push some, to lobby on some ideas and some recommendations that would have a better chance of being accepted than they would have done 12 months or 2 or 3 years previously.
Thank you, Adam. That's really helpful. We've got loads of questions, so I'm going to kind of we'll get through those and really, Adam, also feel free to chip in if there's anything you want to say about in response to any of these. But we'll start with Beth. Recently, I FOI'd an EIA from our local authority regarding a huge area with a dangerous contraflow cycle layout, cars reversing out into cyclists, which is being reproduced in a seafront area redesign. And she says the EIA was woefully poor, barely a tick box exercise. This is baking in inequalities, as for example, a recumbent trike or child on a bike is less visible. Also, the current layout is rarely used by many due to real or perceived dangers. How do we ensure more than lip service is paid to EIAs? I don't know if anybody wants to say that.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to have a go. I think it's a really interesting issue. And maybe a slight cop-out to say that the recommendation concerning building social justice into transport planning might be the long-term answer, because I imagine that bad EIAs are a result of a lack of knowledge and maybe a lack of understanding within the authority. Maybe it's giving them the benefit of the doubt to say that, but I think that's likely to be the case. I don't think there are many people who feel true malice towards people with protected characteristics. I think it's just that they're possibly struggling with the practicalities of doing it well. So it's about bringing in the skills and the resource to do these things to the necessary standard, seems to me. Yes. Maybe we can say generally that Ersilia and I can box and cox on this, so feel free, Ersilia, to come in at any point. Don't feel you have to answer a particular question.
Ersilia, do you have anything to add to that? Or
I think it's covered now. Yes, fine. Yeah.
Right, we'll move on to Mark. Given that inclusive mobility is guidance which sets out a range of options and has nuance, what would need to happen to make it a standard, and who would enforce it?
Mark, you ask an entirely fair question for which I'm underqualified to answer. But I suppose I would point to the Manual for Streets, which I think also has nuance, and to the extent that it's taken up, the world is a better place in the places where it has been taken up. Maybe what we would see is some kind of organic process where the current document would get honed, and with time it would get sharper and people would find it easier to apply. But again, I suppose your point is a really good one in that the Manual for Streets is applied to a greater extent where it's precise and less so where it's vague. So maybe what we're talking about is some process of evolution. And maybe in due course, inclusive mobility itself can be replaced by something which is more satisfactory to all concerned.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose related to that, my kind of question around that would be, what does that mean when you're thinking about children, for example? I mean, I'm not really aware of any guidance that really addresses what children might need, that draws on a kind of more solid evidence base. It doesn't just see them as mini adults. I don't know if you know that. I mean, you must have had quite a bit of evidence around children that came to the inquiry. Was that something that...
Well, very much so. In fact, one of our witnesses at the hearing was Karen G from Cyclesbrog, and she made a very strong case for thinking, well, Ersilia used the term a child lent, and I think that's spot on, which is trying to inculcate that and make it standard practice. Whether that's something as simple as making sure that young people are involved in the discussions that lead to the planning decisions, or maybe in a slightly more regimented fashion, trying to think of what the design implications are of allowing for people of lots of different sizes and level of competence.
Yeah, I'm more thinking, I suppose, about the way that children move being different, often younger children particularly perhaps, and it's sort of a bit more complicated than that. But yeah, I think we have a bit of a mini adult approach, don't we, to everything, a sort of very sort of normative, and so we struggle with anybody who in any way doesn't fit this kind of very normative idea of who should be moving around. And yeah, I suppose it would be interesting to see.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting, at least international example I've seen where like redesigning a less pedestrianized area, which is not necessarily, I mean, talking about like providing for working in a slightly different way and bringing a conversation about play and like playgrounds, which are not necessarily caged, but like blurring the boundaries and like thinking about children's ways of moving around and children's needs to play in public space, connected with like rethinking active travel in general, which is a very complex approach. I've seen it in Barcelona somehow has been passed through, and also with like co-designing with kids some of the playgrounds that they implemented in the new super blocks, which was a really interesting example of like perhaps the more clear I have in terms of like using a child lens. In the submission, there was a lot of really good analysis of why things are not working. I think we need to do a lot more work ourselves and think about imagining ways in which this can be implemented, like on a policy level, really.
Yeah, and it would be really interesting to see that. Are all those submissions publicly available then? Will they be?
That might be one for Mr. Kaufman.
It's a good question, and the answer is no. Unfortunately, the intention was to make them publicly available. We had a massive response, and Tom might be able to tell me Tom Ersilia might be able to tell me how many actual responses we got. I think it was, I mean, a massive response for an APPG inquiry, I should say. I mean, not for a DFT type consultation. I think it was around 90 or 100 responses. And the intention was to put them on the internet, and we actually did state that. But the decision was made that we weren't going to do it. If anyone, I mean, there were a few people that said that they didn't want their submissions published, but only a very small handful. If anyone on this call would particularly like to read a one or two inquiries from someone, I'm happy to share those directly, but we won't be publishing them, I'm sorry to say.
That's a shame. Thank you, though. We'll move on through the questions. Tim Morton says, I'm a new bikeability instructor. On Mondays, we usually have some children who can't ride a bike. We spend a few hours helping them learn. A few do. However, bikeability is moving to a digital platform. Unlike a paper consent form, the parent now needs to log on the app to register their child. There's an early question, can your child ride a bike? And if they say no, that's the end of the engagement and their child doesn't come out for the training. Who do you think will be trained to ride safely in the future? And I guess I suppose I would add to that is also, I mean, certainly that's a massive complete barrier altogether, there being an app for a lot of parents. I don't know whether that still happens when it's done through school, but yeah, I don't know if you know anything about that.
I can't answer on that specifically, but I think it makes our point really well, which is that cycle training has immense potential, but you have to remove all of the barriers. And there are practical ones of that sort. There are cultural ones, and they're much of the time doing the worst harm in terms of deterring people. But the specific of if your child can't ride a bike, then they're not going to be taught to ride a bike. Well, that's Kafkaesque, isn't it? That doesn't seem to me to be a good reason for that. Removing things like a requirement to use an app seems to me to be eminently doable. But maybe the practical thing to do is to embed cycle training in broader community interaction. So it's nice, it's sunny, there's a party in the park, there are lots of bikes about. People might come to that for any number of reasons. Oh, look, there's an opportunity to learn to ride a bike. That seems to me to be one of the ways in which we can overcome some of these unnecessary structural barriers.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And then we've got Bev from Cambridge. On bike hangers, is there scope to encourage councils to be more accepting of residential bike parking over car storage, or is that not something that's in your remit?
Well, I determine my own remit. I'm an academic. No one tells me what I think. I suppose from the perspective of social justice and active travel, it isn't automatically an issue for social justice, although you could make a case that car owners are typically wealthier than, I don't think even that flows. There is obviously a very strong case for reallocating more of the highway to cycle storage from car storage for reasons that I hardly need to tell anyone on this call. And to the extent there's an answer, it's find the enlightened few, I suppose, and get them to do some evangelism. Maybe they'll listen to local people's campaigns, and that's obviously happened to an extent, but maybe there's a case for local authority stakeholders, councillors and so forth, hearing from neighbouring authorities that have done more of it, learning that it's nothing to fear, that it might actually be something to celebrate, and then we might see the sort of change that we need to see. But even in the authorities that are going for it in quite a big way, it's still patchy, and it's not as if there's one on every street corner. We've got a long way to go.
Yeah, and I think particularly for those areas where there's no, people have no other possible places to store bikes, are so important. H has a question around pavement parking, and I think you did touch on this really, that kind of what would you envisage that being the solution, if there was a solution to pavement, if they did decide to act on this?
Allow me to refer to my paper copy of the inquiry report, because I think it's probably best if I give you chapter and verse. We note the consultation conducted in England in 2020 and urge the current government to take action on this issue. Specifically, we endorse the option of making the enforcement of the crime of unnecessary obstruction a civil matter, which will enable local authorities with civil parking enforcement powers to issue penalty charge notices to those breaking the law. This could be implemented quickly and give local authorities discretion on enforcement based on the specifics of their area or the severity of the obstruction. I won't go on. So the point being that this was the middle way of the options presented in the consultation. There was the outright ban. The parliamentarians were given some opportunity to think about this, and they decided that this was the way they wanted to go. I think they felt that the outright ban would be both draconian and quite difficult to make stick, whereas the decriminalisation approach would enable like the most egregious examples of pavement parking to be dealt with quite rapidly, and the local authorities involved would have a financial incentive to do so. That was their logic. I don't know whether that I'm not necessarily addressing your point about legislation dating back to the 19th century age, so forgive me if I don't respond in the level of detail that you might be hoping for.
Thank you, Tom. Tim, says the installation of anti-terror bollards are causing some difficulties for adapted cycles, as they're not always at 1,500 centres, more often 1,200 centres, and with a tolerance that on occasion are narrower. I don't know if that's a comment or a question. Anything? Yeah.
It seems to be a bit of both. Well, this feels as if it's access control barrier territory, doesn't it? Do the bollards need to be that close together in order to serve their function of deterring terrorists driving vehicles? Don't know. But that's a really interesting point, and one which I'll definitely share with our colleagues who are working on the access control barriers project. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And actually, I think Mark, you might want to come in here, but you've I think talked about this before at a previous session. Is he there, Mark? He's gone off. Yeah, it is something definitely that we have looked at here, I think, in the past, Tom, if that's useful.
Yeah, we have some ongoing research on that our colleague is reading. So she's monitoring access removal, so barrier removal, and seeing what happens with some vivacity cameras. So hopefully we're gonna have some interesting results in terms of like question of like, are they needed, do they work, and was kind of actually prevented to access paths and cycle lanes.
But yeah, it would be great to hear. Yeah, what you find
next year. I think they're doing the monitoring now.
Mark Smithy says access to cycling is also restricted for young people in London and presumably other cities because cycle hire excludes those under 18. And actually, usually e-scooters as well.
Well, in the case of e-scooters, because it remains a trial, you have to have a driving license, I think, to be able to register on the scheme. So, but don't get me started on whether e-scooters constitute active travel. We haven't time. Yeah, fair point. What can you do, Mark? No doubt there will be what are thought of as good reasons why there is that age limit on cycle hire. But, well, certainly around me, I see people who are using Lime bikes who may not be that old. So people are finding their ways around.
Here as well, I think. Yeah. Very much enjoyed by the under 18s. I was looking through. Shane says, are the social justice arguments something that is applied in both directions? I have the impression that a component of the opposition to LTNs is specifically framed as a social justice issue, i.e. opposition to active travel interventions as social justice promotion. How do we resolve this?
Without wanting to throw you under the bus, Ersilia, I think this is probably you, given you've worked on an LTN project for the last several years.
Yeah, we have an interest. I don't know if we have an interesting. We've done a lot of work on LTNs. We interview a lot of residents in London, part of another project, and we've been kind of thinking about which kind of sorts of like argument discourses people use to oppose them. And we've seen like it is the social justice argument. There's a lot of like arguments which we can bring under the umbrella like climate delays discourses. They're like instrumentalizing some certain tropes to kind of revert common kind of motives why LTNs are good. I think the social justice one is an interesting one. We did run some research looking at whether, for example, the argument around like people from modified communities living on boundary roads was actually standing, and we found out the picture is very, very complex. I think we need to be careful when certain arguments are weaponized and they're made to like some very big generalizations made on the basis of some cases in which it is true that some people from certain minoritized groups are affected by intervention by LTNs, and we need to adjust interventions to make sure that they can get around. I think the argument of like disabled people, disabled residents being kind of detrimentally affected by LTNs is been used many times. We've been doing a lot of work with Transport for All, which is a disabled people-led organization, and we found that it's a very complete picture. We have people with the same impairment who use different modes of transport. So the same impairment means that people are really benefiting from having kind of traffic reduction schemes, and some people that are relying on a car might find it much harder. So we need to kind of like make sure the schemes take into account of those needs. But I think the issues when like big, like small, like very contextual issues that are happening are weaponized to create a big discussion. And I think social justice is much more complex than the way it's been used in those discourses. If you're interested, like we are going to publish a lot of different papers, and also we have a couple of videos coming out on our research on LTNs where we're going to touch upon all of this kind of discussion. So we'll be very happy to share it in the next few months.
That would be really fantastic. Thank you, Ersilia. And I suppose I've got one final question. I think we've gone through all the questions in the Q&A. Was there anything that you didn't receive submissions about? Was there anything that sort of surprised that you thought or not as much as you would have liked? Was there anyone, if we're thinking about this as a social justice issue, was anybody missing?
Nothing springs to mind. What about you, Ersilia?
Perhaps I think something that someone like the previous question made me think about. There's a certain age group which always get forgotten, which is like younger adults. So perhaps there's been like I think there's been a couple of submissions talk about like young women walking at night, but I think it's one of those groups that gets really kind of forgotten in research and policy sometimes. And yeah, I think if I think about that in terms of old groups that we've been talking about, that could be one that didn't appear that strongly in the submissions.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I guess then you think about as well, there's both from the perspective of safety. Well, it's quite broad, that, isn't it? And who feels unsafe, and who's also targeted sometimes as as the figure of the person who might be putting others at risk, you know, that kind of fear of people in public space. So, yeah.
Sally, may I be impertinent and ask whether we could bring in our strategic guest star one more time, just to talk about where next with this work? Sorry to put you on the spot, Adam, but people are probably going to be interested to know. We've done this report, it was released in March, and no doubt the APPG has plans to try to get these recommendations put before ministers, or maybe has already done that.
Yeah, so we sent the report and letters to Simon Lightwood primarily. We did get a response, but thing is coming about government at the moment. It's all about, oh, we're going to be covering this kind of stuff in X, Y, and Z that's coming up in the future. So it was quite, I think, disappointing, really. I mean, I didn't expect them to suddenly change policy over what we'd recommended, unfortunately, but I thought that the response we got was slightly lukewarm and just being respectful rather than particularly helpful. So we are certainly we're still pushing on this. We really haven't, you know, not that we're going to give up on it, but we are still promoting this as an active an active sort of policy of ourselves of the group. I think that hopefully some of the stuff that's been promised in the latter half of 2025 will address some of the issues that we highlighted in the report. And that's me being optimistic, glass half full. So I just feel the response we got was just a little bit lukewarm, to be honest. I don't know whether anyone else on the call who's got their ear to the ground with DFT is able to shed any light on what DFT may or may not do in the next 6 months, that there's all these rumors that they are going to be doing. But we do understand that pavement parking, there's definitely going to be some movement on pavement parking, I think, in the next 3 to 6 months. But perhaps someone on this call has got better intel than I do.
Run down the bookies if you do.
Yeah, we wait with bated breath. Well, that just remains for me to thank our speakers enormously. I'm sure everybody would like me to join me in that. It was really, really great to hear more about it and about the kind of the background to it all, and really hoping that we see a bit of action in the next few months. Or
can I say one more thing? I mean,
yeah.
If people are inclined to write to their MPs about active travel issues, there'd be absolutely no harm in sending them the link and, you know, perhaps their personal top 3 or 4 recommendations from that report, just so that we did spread the report out very widely within Parliament. But I think if an MP is written by their constituent about a particular parliamentary style report, I do think that would be useful.
There you go. That's your homework, everybody, is to go away and get in touch with your MP. Thanks again. And it just leaves me to say that next week will be, I think, is our final session before we take a break for the summer. We have Adrian Lord, who is just back from New Zealand, where he was head of cycling at Auckland Transport, and his talk's going to focus on the city's active travel successes and challenges. And we also have Harry Gray, who's going to join us, who's a walking and cycling campaigner based in Manchester, and he's one of a small group behind a new campaign and policy hub, People Powered Streets, that aims to support advocates of active travel across the UK to better connect and deliver change. So do join us if you want to hear more about that. And hope to see some of you next week. Thanks, everyone.